Welcome to today's live stream. I'm going to get started in a minute. Just need to let everybody know the stream is getting ready to go on. Okay, I'm having okay, I'm just going to get started. And today's live stream is going to be about chemistry and the intangible elements of storytelling. Now, when it comes down to storytelling, there are two types of elements of storytelling. There are tangible elements, which are your plot, your theme, your prose style, and then there are intangible elements to your story. Now, the intangible elements of a story are those things we don't we don't see as related to the story, but they are things that we feel and connect to from what we read between the lines as related to the story. So those are the intangible elements of a story, those elements that we feel from between the lines. And it's those intangible elements of a story that are the things that we feel, and those are the things that enable us to really imagine the words coming to life. And those intangible elements start with the what I call the chemistry, and the chemistry starts with the characters in the story. Now, chemistry is something that characters have when they interact with each other, and it's that interaction between those fictional characters that allows us to feel that those characters are real and coming alive on the page. So when you have characters that have chemistry with each other, then you're going to have characters that really come to life. And as they come to life in the story, then what's going to happen is these characters are going to draw the reader into the story. So when you have two characters with strong chemistry, then what happens is they create an energy about themselves, and that energy is the thing that draws the reader into the story and gets the reader compelled to keep reading. So, chemistry is a very important element to storytelling. And when your characters have great chemistry, then the readers are more engaged in the story. And this is one of the things that motivates your readers to continue reading the story. Now, when I started writing the novel, The Temptation of John Haynes, I didn't know that much about how chemistry worked. But when I put two characters I never planned to put together, Easteme and John Haynes together, that's when I started to see how chemistry came to life on the page. Because with those two characters, I started to see how chemistry really worked and how these two characters really work well together, how they really synergized well together, and how they really played off each other and bounced off each other, and how they had this fantastic energy between both characters, and how that energy was the thing that got people into the story, and also got people compelled to continue reading the story from page 1 all the way up to page 400. So when I put those two characters together, they had personality traits that played well off each other, and those personality traits allowed the readers to connect with the characters, relate to the characters, identify with the characters, and it allowed the characters to really come to life, and that chemistry allowed that energy to swirl around them. And when that energy swirled around them, then what happened was those characters went from being words on a page to actual people who came to life. And as they came to life in the reader's imagination, people began to connect with the characters, and they began to connect with their story. So that's one of the things that you can do with two characters in a romantic setting. And then there are characters that had great chemistry all by themselves, and they just had a magnificent energy. So I did this with the Matilda Crowley character in Spellbound, who also had great chemistry, but she had chemistry where she could just work with any character because she had this great energy about herself, and that energy allowed her to create a picture of herself in people's imagination, and her story was very compelling. Leon, how do you create a good character that's not a Mary Sue? Well, the way you create a compelling character is to just think about people you know, people you've experienced, and what you do is you create a character. And with Mary Sue's, they are characters that don't have any flaws and don't make mistakes. But when you create a balanced character, they are going to have flaws, they are going to have mistakes, they are going to have struggles, and they're going to have internal character flaws and external character flaws. And these are going to help us see why this character is relatable, why this character is somebody we should care about, and how this character has to overcome these personal issues that they're dealing with as they try to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. For example, when I was writing the novel Spellbound, I created the Matilda Crowley character, and the Matilda Crowley character, when I wrote her, was this introvert, and her goal in the book was to find her voice, and that character flaw was one of the things that was preventing her from finding her voice, and she had to overcome these fears that she had about being biracial, about dealing with bullies in her school, and she had to overcome even her own insecurities about her relationship with her father. And all of these things were things she needed to overcome. And when you have a good character has internal character flaws that they are trying to work on as they're trying to meet the goals that they want to achieve in the book. And those internal character flaws are the things that make the character somebody we relate to, connect with, and identify with. So when you have a Mary Sue character, she has no flaws. She is completely infallible. She faces no challenges. She faces no obstacles. Whereas a rich, multidimensional character, they have flaws. They have things that they struggle with. They have internal character flaws. They have external character flaws. They have things that they struggle with. And it's these struggles that make this character relatable to the reader and make them come to life because they are imaginary, but they become real to us as we read them off the page. And that's one of the things that relates to today's topic, which is, again, that chemistry and those intangible elements of storytelling. Now, I went over the chemistry part, and again, the chemistry part is very important because it's that chemistry that allows us to really connect with those characters. When you have two characters who are very bold, very dynamic, and what's going to happen is they are going to be so compelling that you're going to feel that energy swirling around them. And that energy is, again, one of those things that's going to get you compelled to pick up their story and read their story from the first page to the last, like many readers have done with The Temptation of John Haynes, with John Haynes and Easteen, and they've also done it with other John Haynes and Easteen books, where like Easteen, Little Girl Lost, where John Haynes and Easteen have a scene together, but it's got such fantastic chemistry that you can feel that these two characters really love each other, really care about each other, even though they're fictional characters. They feel alive to you. So that chemistry brings them to life. And that's one of the core elements to intangible storytelling. Now, that chemistry can be done in a romance novel, and a lot of people know chemistry from romance novels, but it is also done with individual characters as well. And I talked about that with Matilda Crowley and how she came to life for a lot of readers with Spellbound, how the character came alive because she just had such a relatable story and such an identifiable story that people really connected with her as a person. Same thing with a character I did called Nikki Desmond from the All About Nikki books. She also came to life for readers, and that showed again how the character had a very strong energy that allowed the reader to connect with the reader. Now, chemistry is one of the elements, intangible elements of storytelling. Another element of intangible element of storytelling has to do with what I call the spirit of the story. Now, the spirit of a story is something that is what I is something that's again another intangible, but it is something that the reader feels when they go and start reading the story. Sometimes when a reader gets into a story, they start to feel things as related to mood, as related to tone, and these things are like a fingerprint on every book that you feel this spirit as related to the letters of the words, and it's that spirit that really makes that book come to life. And that spirit is something that is like a unique fingerprint on every book. So you could be reading one book and it will have one energy all about it, like a romance novel. And then you could be reading another book and it has a completely different energy than the book you're reading before. So each of these books, it's literally, it has this spirit all about it. It has this energy that brings it to life. And it's that energy that makes that book really makes it feel unique and distinct. And when people feel that spirit of those words, that's something that also makes people connect to that story and makes it special for them. So a lot of people think that stories just are just words on a page. I don't believe that stories are just words on a page. I believe that stories have a soul, and that soul is on the page, that soul really is the thing that makes that story feel alive for the reader. In addition to a story having a soul, I also believe that many stories have a heart. And that heart comes from the passion of the writer. You can, in some cases, feel that passion that that writer has for the story that they're writing when you're reading those words, because I've read the difference between a story where the writer had passion for their words, and then I've read stories where the writer really didn't really feel, I didn't feel any energy from it, and the story, it just didn't come to life for me. It was just basically words on a page, but it had no real passion as related to what was being presented. So there are stories out there where people write a story and it has no soul and it has no heart, and it feels like the writer is going through the motions. So there's a big difference between a story a writer writes that has a soul as related to it and a story that a writer writes where they're going through the motions. So you want to really want a story, when you're a writer, you really want to put your heart and soul on the page, because the reader is going to connect with those words. And this is something a lot of people, when they watch movies like the new Star Wars trilogy, you can just feel how dead that movie is, because it really does not have any of the heart that George Lucas's movies have, doesn't have any of the soul that George Lucas's movies have, didn't have any of the spirit George Lucas's movies had, and it just feels flat and uninspired. It feels like it has none of those intangible elements that really draw you into the story. It just feels like you're going through the motions. And these are elements, again, these intangible elements can mean the difference between a technically good story and a story that becomes a classic. Because some writers, yes, they are technically sound, their prose is rock solid, their dialogue is crisp, their presentation is top notch, but when you read their story, you just can't connect with it. It doesn't compel you, and it doesn't give you that reason to care. It just doesn't resonate with you. And it really, the reason why it doesn't resonate with you is because it feels mechanical, it feels by the numbers, and you don't really get that energy from the chemistry of the characters. You don't get any of the passion from the writer coming from their heart, and you really don't get that soul, that energy that brings that story to life. So that's something that a really solid writer, when they get out here, when they write a story, they want to give you those intangible elements. Yes, they want to give you great prose and great style, but they want to execute it in a way where you're reading that story and you're saying, hey, these characters, they are alive to me. This story is alive to me. Everything in the story, I'm really connecting with it. And when I read this, I want to get to that. I'm going through 10, 15, 25 chapters in one day. And I've had people with Temptation of John Hayes telling me they read the whole book in 2 days. And again, that's because the book had heart, it had soul, it had spirit, and it had that chemistry. It just came to life for the reader. And that's what you want when you're writing fiction, is you really want to bring that energy to the page, that intangible energy. So when they open that book and that they start reading on that first page, that energy just radiates out of that book and brings that book to life. Leon, yeah, dialogue is something that I had learned over the years. And one of the things I learned to do is just listen to people talking, and that's how I learned how to write dialogue. Because dialogue has two purposes. One, it allows us to get to know the character, and two, it's used to move the story forward. So if you understand those two principles, you're going to be able to write good dialogue. So when I write dialogue, usually I want to give you a sense of a character's voice and I also want to use that to let us get to know that character as a person, because when you, as another one of those intangible elements is voice. So when a reader reads dialogue, they need to hear that character's voice in their heads, and they need to hear this character come alive in a way that this character is speaking to the reader. For example, when I was writing the books for the ISIS series, I always heard Sally Richardson Whitfield as Eastine, and I would hear Samuel L. Jackson as Osiris and Angela Bassett as Queen Isis. And what I would do in order to learn how to write dialogue was I just sat down and I listened to their speech patterns in different movies and different interviews, and that gave me a sense of how to write their dialogue. So once I learned the speech patterns of certain actors, then I started to put my dialogue together. And when I did that, many readers told me almost immediately that Osiris sounded like Samuel L. Jackson, and Queen Isis sounded like Angela Bassett, and Eastine sounded like Sally Richardson. And that was all from me learning how to pick up on speech patterns And when I learned how to pick up on the speech patterns, that helped me how to learn how to write effective dialogue. And I learned those tricks from Sid Field's screenplay, that again, dialogue has two purposes: one, to let us get us to know the characters, and two, to move the story forward. So usually when I write dialogue, I try to keep it to about 2 pages or less, because I really want to move the story forward very quickly, and I don't want the characters talking too much. I just want them to talk enough to get the points across and then move the scene forward. That was something I learned watching the Star Wars original trilogy. Because if you watch George Lucas's Star Wars trilogy, especially Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, they really don't have a lot of extra scenes of dialogue. So everything is quick and to the point, and that's what you want with good dialogue, because you want to get the reader in, have them hear the characters' voices, and move the story forward. Now, that's another intangible, again, of storytelling, is voice, because voices are something that the reader imagines when they're reading the story. And if they're imagining certain voices, that means that they're being drawn into the story. And again, all of these intangible elements, they all bring the reader into the story, and they make the story come alive. And when all of the intangible elements are working well, it's literally like a movie playing in the reader's imagination. So when you have all of your intangible elements of storytelling working well together, then what happens is people start imagining this story coming to life, and it's literally like them watching a movie inside of their imagination. And for some people out here, it goes beyond just being a movie. It's literally like they are standing right there and they're seeing this action going on, and they feel like they're standing right there because the writer has presented things in a very descriptive way, and the way they have presented it is so compelling that the reader they feel like they're right there in that time period, in that era. They feel like they're standing right there. And this is something that people really want to see in a story, is feeling like they're there, feeling like they're right in that part of the world, and they feeling like they're standing there. So that's the sign of really powerful writing. And that's something most writers, they really have, it takes skill to master, but you can do that. And once you understand those intangible elements of storytelling, then you can really create some compelling stories. Because a lot of people, again, they think about the technical aspects, but then they don't think about those intangible aspects. Davon, yeah, that's thing with, I used to do that all the time myself, write too much dialogue. But one of the things that you can do to deal with dialogue issues is you have to be able to read it out. One of the things I would do is, after I would write a chapter, I would read the dialogue aloud. And reading the dialogue aloud, what that does is it gives you a sense of how those words would actually be spoken by someone. And it would give me a sense of how this scene is playing. Because when you have your dialogue and you're reading it aloud, you're seeing that how real people would talk. And that's one of the things that kept me from writing, when I first started out, 5 and 6 pages of dialogue. And now these days I write anywhere from 2 to 3 pages and in a chapter, and only about 1.5 of those pages is dialogue, because I sit down and I just read the page aloud. And sometimes as I'm reading it aloud, I'm correcting it as I'm going, because I'm looking at my own speech patterns and I'm seeing how those speech patterns work into the dialogue. Because that's one of the things a writer has to do, is sit down and really read what they've written. Some people, they try to read in their heads, but that's not as effective as you reading the words aloud. Because when you read the words aloud, what you're doing is you're hearing how this sounds, and once you hear how it sounds, then you can see how the words flow into each other. So that's something that most writers they need to do learn how to do more is just sit down and read the words aloud, because that's going to give you again a sense of the words, a sense of the intangible elements, again like the chemistry, a sense of the a sense of how things are flowing. When you read things aloud and you read them and call out those words, that's going to really help you develop a better writing style. And it's going to give you a sense of how those words are going to work for the reader. Because the reader, they have to, when they read your words, they are reading it from a perspective of not knowing it. But when you read it aloud, it's like you hearing the what the reader is going to see on the page, if that makes any sense. So what you're seeing when you read it aloud is that's gonna give you that sense of, do these words work? Is this story flowing? Are these characters saying what I want them to say? Are these descriptions clear to the reader? So these are things that you want to work on, because when you work on those things, that's going to help you be able to put together a much tighter story, a much more compact story, and your dialogue is going to be a lot sharper and crisper. So that's one of the things you can do to improve your dialogue, is to read it aloud. It's also going to improve your prose, because you're going to see what sentences work, what sentence structures work, and you're going to see how it works on how people talk. Now, some people say you can't write how people talk, but when you read things aloud, you get that sense of how things are going to sound and how it's going to sound when somebody's reading it. So that's a major trick that I use, and it's helped me to really publish some really quality work on the SJS Direct imprint. Excuse me. Now these intangible elements, again, these are things that when they're applied properly, they really get a reader into the story, and they really get readers excited about reading. So you have to really think about those intangible elements of storytelling, because it's those intangible elements of storytelling that can again make a book a classic. Because if you have really good solid intangible elements, they can really open the door for a book to reach a audience. Because sometimes you might have a writer who may not be the most technical, but they can go out here and put a lot of spirit into a story, a lot of heart into a story, a lot of energy in a story, and that chemistry and those energy elements, they can come alive, and they can make that story more compelling than something that is more technically sound. Now, one of the things a writer has to look out for when they're writing a story, is making sure that they don't edit out many of the intangible elements when they go out here and do their editing. Because I remember a book I did called the Cassandra Cookbook back in 2008, and I was listening to literary agents back then, and they told me that I needed to put more detail into the story, and that really prevented the story from being as good as it could be. Now, the way I had wrote it before, it didn't have much detail, but it had a lot of heart, it had a lot of soul, and it had a lot of energy. And what I did when I was listening to the literary agents was I edited out all of the heart, soul, and energy of that book, and it changed the whole spirit and tone of the book from a lighthearted, fun romance to something that wasn't as strong or as compelling as before. And that's something you have to really watch when you're doing editing, because when you have people who edit too much, you can literally cut the heart right out of a story. So that's something you have to think about when you're doing editing, is you don't want to cut the heart out of your story. You don't want to cut the soul out of your story. You don't want to cut the spirit out of your story. You want the mission and the message you put on the page to come to life, and you want the mission and the message that you presented to remain intact, and you want to continue remaining to have that connection with the readers when you're doing that story. So you want all those elements to be there and continue to be there, and you don't want to lose those elements as part of the editing process. Now, the lesson I learned from A Recipe for Success or the Cassandra Cookbook was not to cut out my story to please others, but to present the story that I wanted to present, and then just make sure that when I'm editing, I make that story, make sure that the integrity of that story remains intact. So I really wanted to make sure